Elena Rivera's hands moved with practiced precision, disassembling the Barrett M107A1 rifle. But when she opened her small cleaning kit, a polished metal object rolled out onto the workbench. The sergeant's face went pale when he read the engraving. 247 confirmed eliminations. This wasn't just a weapons technician cleaning rifles. This was something else entirely. And the quiet woman who never spoke about her past was about to reveal why some medals should never be seen. Before continuing this story, please comment below with your city or country where you're watching from. Your feedback inspires us to do better. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the basement armory of Fort Davidson, casting harsh shadows across rows of weapon racks that stretched from floor to ceiling like metallic skeletons. Elena Rivera sat hunched over her workbench in the far corner, surrounded by the familiar symphony of clicking metal, sliding bolts, and the occasional curse from other technicians wrestling with stubborn mechanisms. At 36, she possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that made people forget meeting her within minutes of parting. Average height, chestnut hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and hands that moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who preferred tools to conversation. Sergeant David Martinez approached her workstation with heavy steps, dragging behind him a rifle case that looked like it had seen better decades. The Barrett M107A1 inside was a genuine beast. A 50 caliber anti-materiel rifle, capable of stopping vehicles and punching through concrete walls. Martinez dropped the case next to Elena's bench with a metallic crash, causing several nearby technicians to look up from their work. "Rivera," he called out, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool underground air. "I need this thing cleaned and serviced by 1500 hours. The bolts jammed tighter than a bank vault, and the trigger assemblies acting finicky. Command wants everything ready for tomorrow's range qualification." Elena looked up from the M4 carbine she was reassembling, her gray eyes impassively studying the battered case. "No problem, Sergeant," she replied in the quiet voice that barely carried beyond her workstation. "It'll be running like clockwork by noon." Martinez nodded and headed for the stairs, already moving on to the next item on his endless daily checklist. The moment his boots disappeared up the concrete steps, Elena opened the rifle case with movements that seemed almost reverent. The Barrett lay nestled in custom foam padding, its massive frame designed for one purpose, reaching across impossible distances to targets others couldn't even see. She lifted the rifle with both hands, feeling the familiar weight distribution that awakened muscle memory buried deep in places she tried not to visit during daylight hours. The weapon was indeed jammed, its bolt frozen halfway between closed and open positions. Elena carried the rifle to her workbench and began the field stripping process with movements that flowed like water. Her hands found receiver pins without looking, fingers dancing across surfaces that most weapons technicians would approach with manuals in hand. She disassembled Barrett rifles in complete darkness, in sandstorms capable of stripping paint from metal, and under conditions where one mistake meant the difference between mission success and body bags. The muscle memory was burned into her nervous system like scar tissue that never fully heals. Working, Elena felt the familiar meditation that came with mechanical precision. Each component had its place, its purpose, its connection to every other part of the system. She could lose herself in the rhythm of disassembly and cleaning, letting consciousness drift while hands performed tasks that required no thought. It was safer that way, being busy with immediate problems that had clear solutions. The jam turned out to be a combination of factors: carbon buildup around the gas system, a slightly bent extractor claw, and what looked like desert sand that had somehow found its way into the receiver, despite the weapon supposedly never leaving. The continental United States. Elena raised an eyebrow at that detail but said nothing. Military records were often creative works of fiction, especially when it came to weapons that had seen action in places that officially didn't exist. She moved to the cleaning station and began the methodical process of removing years of accumulated grime and wear. The Barrett responded to her attention like a neglected instrument being tuned by a master musician. Each part received individual attention, every surface examined for signs of wear that could indicate future problems. Elena had long ago learned that weapon maintenance was about predicting failures before they appeared, not just fixing problems after they occurred. As she worked, she noticed the armory gradually growing quieter. Other technicians had finished their morning assignments and moved on to other duties, leaving her alone with the mechanical sounds of her own work. The solitude suited her fine. She'd always felt more comfortable with machines than people, finding honesty in how metal responded to proper care and attention. Reassembling the rifle's trigger group, Elena reached for her small cleaning kit, a compact leather case containing specialized tools she'd accumulated over years of working with precision weapons. The kit had traveled with her through multiple duty stations, its contents carefully selected for maximum versatility. She undid the brass clasps and lifted the lid. A polished metal rolled out onto the workbench with a soft metallic chime. Elena froze, her hands suspended over the kit as if she'd just discovered a coiled snake. The metal lay face up on the steel surface, its silver finish reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. It was roughly the size of a silver dollar, with intricate engraving around the edges that marked it as something official, something important. But it was the inscription in the center that made her stomach clench like a fist. 247 confirmed eliminations. The words were engraved in precise military lettering, each letter cut deep enough to remain readable after years of handling. Below the number sat a small symbol that most people would never recognize, crosshairs with a single star at the center. It was the mark of Shadow Division, a unit that existed only in budget lines and nowhere else, whose operations were buried so deep in classified files that most government officials didn't know of their existence. Footsteps echoed from the stairway. Elena's instincts kicked in automatically, her hand moving to cover the metal while her eyes tracked the sound. Sergeant Martinez was returning, probably to check her progress or bring another weapon needing attention. She had maybe 10 seconds before he'd be close enough to clearly see her workstation. Her fingers closed around the metal, feeling its weight, the warmth of metal that had been held countless times. For a moment, she was transported back to when such honors mattered, when the numbers they represented were achievements rather than burdens. The medal had been presented to her at a ceremony that officially never happened, in recognition of service that would never appear in any public record. Martinez appeared at the top of the stairs, his boots clicking against concrete as he descended into the armory. Elena returned the medal to her cleaning kit with movements that looked casual, but were executed with the precision of someone who'd kept secrets for years. By the time the sergeant reached her workstation, she was already back at work on the Barrett's receiver, her face expressing nothing but professional focus. "How's it going, Rivera?" Martinez asked, leaning against the edge of her bench. "The jam giving you trouble?" "Just carbon buildup and some sand," Elena replied without looking up from her work. "Someone took this rifle places it wasn't supposed to be, but it'll be ready for tomorrow's qualification." Martinez frowned at that assessment. According to the paperwork he'd seen, the Barrett had never left the base armory except for scheduled training sessions at the local range. But Elena had a reputation for finding problems other technicians missed, and her work was always flawless. If she said there was desert sand in the mechanism, then there was desert sand, regardless of what official records claimed. "Any idea how long it's been since this weapon had proper maintenance?" Martinez asked, fishing for information without directly questioning the official story. Elena paused in her cleaning to examine the barrel extension more closely, where wear patterns told stories to those who knew how to read them. And this barrel had stories, written in carbon fouling and metal fatigue that spoke of intensive use in harsh conditions. She could see evidence of hundreds of rounds fired in rapid succession, the kind of sustained shooting that only happened under combat conditions. "Hard to say exactly," she answered carefully, "but judging by the wear patterns, I'd guess it's been at least 6 months since the last thorough cleaning. Maybe longer." Martinez nodded, accepting her assessment without further questions. Elena had never let him down, and he'd learned to trust her judgment on weapon condition. Still, something about the situation bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The rifle was supposedly in storage for the past year, awaiting its turn in the maintenance rotation. How did a weapon in storage accumulate the kind of wear and debris Elena was describing? "Just get it squared away by tomorrow," Martinez said finally. "Brass wants a full demonstration of the Barrett's capabilities for visiting dignitaries, and everything needs to be perfect." After Martinez left, Elena continued working in silence, but her mind was no longer fully focused on the mechanical task before her. The metal's appearance had cracked open doors in her memory that she'd spent 3 years learning to keep closed. Each component she cleaned brought back fragments of the life she'd left behind, a world where precision was measured in heartbeats and distances calculated in minutes of flight time. She remembered the first time she'd held a Barrett M107A1 under combat conditions, its weight different when lives hung in the balance. The rifle had been her constant companion through 18 months of operations that officially never happened, in countries that appeared in no mission reports. She'd learned to read wind patterns like a native language, to calculate bullet drop at distances that pushed the boundaries of what human skill and mechanical precision could achieve together. The metal in her cleaning kit represented the culmination of that period, recognition that she'd become something rare and valuable in the world of special operations. 247 confirmed eliminations meant 247 neutralized threats, 247 completed missions, 247 reasons her teammates came home alive. It also meant 247 faces that visited her dreams, regardless of how justified each shot had been. Elena finished cleaning the barrel and moved on to checking the rifle's scope mounts, examining for any signs of loosening or damage that could affect accuracy. Her hands automatically moved through the inspection process, while her mind drifted back to the circumstances that had led to her transfer from active operations. There had been no dramatic incident, no failure or court-martial that forced her out. Instead, she'd simply reached a point where the weight of accumulated success became heavier than she could carry. The psychological evaluations had been thorough, but inconclusive. She showed no signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, no indication of the emotional breakdown that sometimes struck long-range snipers after extended deployment. Instead, her evaluators found something more troubling: complete emotional detachment from the act of taking human life, a clinical precision that seemed to have replaced normal human responses to violence. They'd offered her medical retirement, disability benefits, and access to counseling programs that could help her process what she'd experienced. Elena had declined all of it, instead requesting transfer to a position where she could continue serving without being required to kill. The armory assignment had seemed perfect. She could use her technical knowledge to maintain weapons in peak condition while avoiding the moral complexities of their ultimate purpose. For 3 years, this arrangement had worked perfectly. She'd become invisible in the way support personnel often do, necessary but unnoticed, competent but unremarkable. Her personnel file listed her previous experience as logistics support, and no one ever thought to question what kind of logistics required such intimate knowledge of precision rifle systems. She'd found peace in the routine of maintenance and repair, satisfaction in problems that could be solved with the right tools and sufficient patience. But the medal's appearance changed everything. It was a reminder that some parts of her past would never stay buried, no matter how carefully she tried to build a new identity. The medal represented not just her service record, but the person she'd been, the skills she'd developed, and the reputation that followed her despite her efforts to disappear into anonymity. As she reassembled the Barrett's trigger mechanism, Elena considered the implications of Martinez discovering the medal. Her cover story was solid enough to withstand surface investigation, but the kind of attention such a discovery might bring could uncover details that were meant to stay classified. Shadow Division guarded its secrets jealously, and former operatives who attracted unwanted attention sometimes found their situations becoming complicated in ways that transcended ordinary military bureaucracy. She paused in her work to examine the medal more closely, studying the engraving with eyes that had learned to notice details others missed. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each line and curve executed with precision that spoke of custom manufacture rather than mass production. This wasn't a standard military decoration, but something created specifically for recognition within a community that existed outside normal chains of command and official acknowledgement. The number 247 represented more than just successful missions. It was testament to a level of skill that few people in the world could claim. Long-range elimination required a combination of technical knowledge, physical ability, and psychological resilience that excluded most candidates before they ever fired a shot in anger. Those who excelled became part of an informal brotherhood that transcended national boundaries and military hierarchies. Elena remembered the weight of expectations that came with her reputation, how mission planners began automatically assigning her the most difficult targets, the ones others couldn't or wouldn't take. She'd become a specialist in impossible shots, the sniper they called when conventional approaches failed. The medal represented recognition from her peers, people who understood exactly what those numbers meant and what they'd cost her to achieve. But it also represented everything she'd walked away from, the isolation of working alone for days or weeks, the moral complexity of making life and death decisions based on intelligence that might be incomplete or inaccurate, the gradual erosion of normal human connections as the demands of operational security made genuine relationships impossible. She'd traded those burdens for the simple satisfaction of maintaining equipment. And until today, she'd never questioned whether the trade was worth it. The Barrett was nearly ready for final function testing when Elena heard footsteps approaching her workstation. This time it wasn't Martinez, but Master Sergeant Rebecca Hayes, the Armory's senior NCO, and someone who'd always shown more interest in Elena's background than was entirely comfortable. Hayes had 22 years of military experience across various specialties, and she possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that came from watching patterns over decades of service. "Good afternoon, Rivera," Hayes said, settling into a chair beside Elena's workbench. "Martinez tells me you found some interesting wear patterns on this Barrett." Elena continued working on the rifle's final assembly, not trusting herself to meet Hayes's eyes directly. The Master Sergeant had a talent for reading people that made conversations with her feel like interrogations, even when they were supposed to be casual. "Nothing too unusual, Sergeant. Just signs that someone put it through more intensive use than the paperwork suggests." Hayes picked up one of the cleaned components from Elena's bench, the bolt carrier group that gleamed under the fluorescent lighting. Her examination was thorough and knowledgeable, the kind of inspection that came from years of working with precision weapons. "You know, Rivera, I've been in this business long enough to recognize certain types of wear patterns. This bolt carrier has seen the kind of sustained firing that only happens under very specific circumstances." The observation hung in the air between them like a question that hadn't been directly asked. Elena knew Hayes was fishing for information, but she wasn't sure whether the Master Sergeant suspected something about the rifle's history or her own past. Either possibility was dangerous in ways that could cascade beyond simple curiosity. "Combat weapons tend to show different wear than training rifles," Elena replied carefully. "Maybe this one saw action overseas before ending up here." Hayes placed the bolt carrier back on the workbench with deliberate precision, her eyes never leaving Elena's face. "That's possible, I suppose. Though according to the paperwork, this particular rifle has never left the continental United States. Makes me wonder how it picked up all that desert sand you mentioned to Martinez." Elena felt a cold weight settling in her stomach as she realized Hayes's interest extended beyond casual curiosity. The Master Sergeant was building something, accumulating details that could eventually add up to conclusions Elena couldn't afford to have drawn. She finished installing the Barrett's trigger group and began the process of final function testing, using the mechanical routine to buy time while she considered her options. "Records aren't always complete, Sergeant," she said finally. "Weapons get transferred, loaned out, used for purposes that don't always make it into official documentation." Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying Elena with the kind of patient attention that suggested she had all day to continue the yard conversation. "Fair enough. But you know what really interests me, Rivera? It's your level of familiarity with this particular weapons system. Most weapons techs would need to consult technical manuals for proper Barrett maintenance. You worked on it like you'd done it 1,000 times before." The observation was accurate and dangerous. Elena had indeed serviced Barrett rifles hundreds of times, but that experience was supposed to be invisible, buried under a cover story that portrayed her as a logistics specialist with general weapons maintenance training. Hayes's comment suggested her competence had become noticeable in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I've always been interested in learning different weapon systems," Elena replied, testing the rifle's bolt action with smooth, practiced movements. "The Barrett's a fascinating piece of engineering." Hayes smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Fascinating indeed, especially when you consider its primary purpose. This isn't a weapon designed for general infantry use, Rivera. It's a specialized tool for very specific applications, most of which require extensive training to master." Elena completed the function testing and began cleaning up her workbench, organizing tools with methodical precision that had become second nature over years of military service. She could feel Hayes watching her every movement, cataloging details that might eventually form a pattern. The conversation was moving in directions that threatened to expose secrets that needed to stay buried. All weapons have their purpose, Sergeant, she said, keeping her voice neutral. My job is just to make sure they function properly when called upon. Hayes stood from her chair, brushing imaginary dust from her uniform. Of course. But some weapons have more specialized purposes than others. Take this Barrett, for example. In the right hands, it's capable of engaging targets at ranges that would challenge even experienced marksmen. Requires someone with very specific training and experience to use effectively. The implication in Hayes's words was becoming impossible to ignore. The Master Sergeant was all but stating her suspicion that Elena's background included experience with precision rifle systems that went far beyond basic armory maintenance. Whether she was fishing for information or already possessed knowledge she was testing, the situation was developing in ways that required careful handling. Elena closed her cleaning kit, making sure the metal was securely positioned where it wouldn't accidentally fall out again. The brass clasps clicked with finality that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet armory. She looked up to meet Hayes's gaze directly for the first time in the conversation. The Barrett's ready for tomorrow's demonstration, Sergeant, she said with calm professionalism. Full function testing completed. Accuracy should be within specifications. Hayes nodded slowly, accepting the change of subject, but making it clear she considered the conversation far from finished. Excellent work, Rivera. As always, your attention to detail is exactly what we need in this department. After Hayes left, Elena remained at her workbench, staring at the perfectly maintained Barrett M107A1 that sat before her like a monument to skills she'd tried to forget. The rifle represented an intersection of her past and present, equipment that bridged the gap between who she'd been and who she was trying to become. Its presence in the armory was a reminder that complete escape from one's own history was rarely possible, especially when that history included capabilities few people in the world possessed. She ran her hand along the rifle's stock, feeling the subtle textures that spoke of countless hours of use. The Barrett was more than just a weapon. It was an extension of the operator's will, a tool that converted intention into action at distances that challenged ordinary human limitations. In the right hands, it was capable of precision that bordered on miraculous, able to reach across miles to touch targets that others couldn't even see. Elena had once been among the handful of people in the world who could unlock the Barrett's full potential. She understood its ballistics, its limitations, its temperamental nature under different environmental conditions. She knew how wind affected bullet trajectory at various ranges, how temperature influenced powder burn rates, how humidity could alter the flight characteristics of a .50 caliber projectile traveling at supersonic velocities. But more than technical knowledge, she'd possessed the psychological makeup that allowed her to apply that knowledge under the extreme stress of combat operations. She'd learned to control her breathing, to find the natural pause between heartbeats where the perfect shot lived, to make life and death decisions with the cold calculation of a machine. Those skills had made her invaluable to Shadow Division, but they'd also isolated her from normal human experience in ways that eventually became unbearable. The medal in her cleaning kit represented both her greatest professional achievement and the moment she'd realized that excellence in killing wasn't the kind of success she wanted to be remembered for. The morning brought increased activity to the armory as preparations continued for the visit from Stryker Defense Corporation executives and representatives from the Senate Defense Committee. Martinez rushed between weapon racks like a caffeinated bee, hustling and cursing everyone within earshot. Hayes, in contrast, seemed perfectly calm but maintained her intelligence-gathering gaze, sometimes stopping near Elena longer than usual, as if checking whether any new secrets had sprouted in her hands overnight. When Elena walked past a group of young technicians, she heard one of them, Joshua Blake, whisper to another, "Rivera's weird, right? Nobody figures out the Barrett that fast." His buddy shook his head with a smirk, shooting a sideways glance at Elena. "Yeah, they also say she stays after hours not for the overtime, but because she just likes talking to the hardware more than people. Hell, sometimes I think she's having a romance with those rifles." "Better a rifle than someone like you," Elena parried as she walked by, adding with sardonic half-smile, "At least the barrel doesn't ask stupid questions." At her workbench, she lifted the Barrett, and, like a master of shadows, checked its condition once more. The metal annoyingly reminded her of itself somewhere among the brushes and oil bottles. Senior Technician Kimov, a typical master of long tongues, came closer and planted his elbows on the table. Elena, did you really used to do something more serious than hardware? That thing you hide looks like something from movies about black ops organizations. Kimov, she said without turning her head, if I were doing something more serious than hardware right now, you'd need to start running faster than usual. Clear? Kimov grinned and raised his hands in demonstrative peace. Come on, don't throw around threats. I understand everything. Within these walls, everyone's a little bit not who they seem. By lunchtime, when the armory emptied for a moment, Hayes said to her, Rivera, come with me to the office. There's work. Inside, Elena felt slightly cold. Usually such invitations meant only one thing: unpleasant questions and meetings with people whose faces you remember long afterward in nightmares. Hayes's office was pale gray, walls decorated with army posters, seemingly for decoration, but more likely as reminders. You are nothing. The system is everything. Sit down, the sergeant said. Today's an important day. We need not to screw up. Our guests from Stryker want to see real shooting, not a kindergarten demonstration. Elena raised an eyebrow. Real? Why do they need to watch a piece of iron punch through an even bigger piece of iron? Has the world really become so short on entertainment? Hayes smirked. For them, it's not entertainment. They need to make sure their investments are justified, that we're not keeping slackers here. I see. So you want me to be their magician with the rifle? Elena said sarcastically. Yes, exactly that. I need someone who will put on a show but won't mess up. Your experience, however much you hide it, speaks for itself. Elena fell silent, staring intently at the table. She knew, if she agreed now, her carefully constructed life as a simple technician would crumble. Each shot would be like an autograph in the spotlight, and then questions, investigations, possibly even visits from old acquaintances with short memories and long instructions. But refusing meant letting some 6-month rookie represent the department, allowing her work to go to waste because of fumbling hands. She couldn't stomach such an insult. Fine, Hayes. Her voice became firm. I'll put on the show, but if they start asking who I am afterward, you better come up with a new cover story for me. Hayes nodded. Cover stories are my job. Just don't let me down. At the range, the smell of fresh gunpowder, metallic clanging, excited chatter from visitors, and sticky sunshine. Elena checked the rifle, leaned toward the scope as if it were a last kind word before battle. Young Officer Brian Reynolds, in a frenzy, threw empty phrases at the crowd. Now we'll see what our beauty is capable of. If anyone's scared, I suggest covering your ears. Elena smiled restrainedly, not taking her eyes off the rifle as if really talking to it. Martinez whispered to her, If you miss, I'll say you forgot to clean the barrel. If I miss, you'll say you forgot to ask me in time. In the crowd, Stryker Representative George Watson, arrogant with metallic gleam in his eyes, watched Elena's every movement too intently. She felt dozens of eyes on her. Someone had spotted the medal on her belt, a silver circle that still looked too conspicuous. And someone was already whispering with laughter. Is that like a talisman, or did she actually waste someone? The first shot, a steel disc at a kilometer's distance. The shot like a hammer blow against the very silence. The disc shuddered, a clear dent in it. Watson whispered to his companion, I've only seen that before with specialists. She's trained to shoot not to wound, but to mock the laws of physics to the maximum. Second shot, a clay block at head height. It exploded like army boots during military exercises. The crowd applauded, but the truth was that no one understood how difficult it was to hit that correctly. For Elena, child's play. For most, the limit of dreams. Rivera, Hayes said sternly. For good measure, 3 more shots in a row, at useless targets, for those who don't understand how your craft works. Elena lowered her scope and, looking at Hayes, smirked. So, especially smart corporate clients, don't think they've been sold a cheap Chinese knockoff? Hayes didn't laugh. She answered quietly. Exactly. The demonstration concluded, but Elena felt the atmosphere around her thickening. After the shooting, she was surrounded by the curious, among whom Watson particularly stood out. Miss Rivera, may I ask a question? Did you serve in units we usually only see in reports marked top secret? Elena barely restrained her irony. In reports, I usually only leave fingerprints on the bolt. All you need to know is that I can fix and lay down the Barrett better than any of your analysts. Returning to the armory, she noticed how department rivals examined her rifle and medal with new interest. Kimov casually drawled, "You put everyone in their place today." Even that Watson looked like he'd swallowed a sour lemon. Elena answered, as always, with sharp mockery. A sour lemon isn't a diagnosis yet. But if I'd failed, they would have said, "Who let this woman near weapons?" That evening, Elena sat in her apartment, where everything was absurdly minimal. A couch, lamp, table, toolbox, box of medals, her entire life in a couple square meters, with a view of old textile factory warehouses. In the kitchen, her neighbor James Hall, an old army buddy, came by with a bag of beer. "Heard how you shut them all down today? Think they'll give you a raise or just write your name on a cemetery memorial?" Elena smirked. "If they start writing me on a memorial, put a bottle of beer right on the stone, not in a flower vase. You know, Elena, if I had your talent, I'd have left long ago to work for Silas Corp and wouldn't drink with anyone. But you can only be one thing. You know how to know, not just pretend you know." Right, Hall. Knowing how to know is a heavy cross. No matter how hard you try, people always find a way to ask you about everything. Days passed. In the warehouse, the smell of metal and oil, as always, overwhelmed all thoughts about the meaning of life. But after the famous demonstration, attitudes toward Elena changed. Some feared her, some respected her, others envied her, suspected her of everything imaginable, from secret service to love of sugar and tea. One day, a newcomer girl approached her, Samantha Jennings, timid but bold. "Elena, tell me honestly, have you ever been discriminated against here?" "I've only been here 2 weeks, but I've already noticed. If a woman disassembles heavy weapons, guys start making faces like they've seen a cat climbing on the table." Elena smirked, looking at Jennings over her glasses. "Here everyone discriminates, against everyone else, by degree of ability not to screw up. And if that pisses you off, then you're already in the coordinate system." "I just can't," Samantha said indignantly. "They call me girl, even though my qualifications are better than half these hobby circles." "The main thing," Elena said with sarcasm, "is that the girl can sell herself professionally better than they can prove their uselessness." Jennings laughed, and for the first time in 2 weeks, took gloves for heavy weapons work without fear. On Monday after lunch, Martinez came to her again. "Rivera, management decided you should conduct shooting training for newbies. All you need to say is that hitting the target is possible not through intuition, but through brains. Can you handle it?" Elena answered laconically, "Brains are a piece goods. I'll have to act as always. 2 minutes of theory, 10 minutes of practical mockery." In the classroom, she stood at the blackboard, before her, a dozen young, fresh faces desperately trying to look cool. Elena began with a simple phrase, "Before you is a rifle. It's a piece of iron with a long history. If you treat it like a machine, it will treat you like an idiot. Remember this. Iron doesn't forget your laziness, it only forgives intelligence." One of the rookies, Greg Foster, with naive humor, "What if we forget to clean it and still hit the target? Does that mean we got lucky?" "Luck is what lazy people use," Elena parried, "until the moment luck decides to choose another favorite. On that day, your vacation will end worse than anything you've seen at the dentist." Everyone laughed, but they learned the lesson. Life went on. Elena, despite her anonymity, gradually stopped being invisible. People from Stryker began visiting the armory more often, sometimes leaving questions at the doors. "Rivera, what did you do before coming here? Rivera, is it true that your medal isn't a souvenir but a prize for something dark?" Elena answered. Everyone with the same irony. "Before coming here, I did the same thing, only the iron was smaller and the heads were harder." And the medal is just a reminder to work honestly. Otherwise, you'll have to report not to management, but to your conscience. That evening, when among the dead instruments of the folding box she again felt her medal, a letter came, a summons to a closed meeting, signed by a service cousin, Lieutenant Lucas McKay, a man whose surname always sounded like he'd stepped off the pages of a comedy about bad spies. The letter had only 2 lines. Elena, found someone who cares. Don't be surprised if you get a new role in the coming days. And yes, congratulations. You've finally stopped being the ghost everyone was afraid of. She looked at the lamp, at the bare table, at the medal in her hand, and for the first time in many years allowed herself a long, quiet laugh. Yeah, stopped being a ghost, she said into the void, but became what I always wanted to be. Someone who turns metal into meaning, irony into a shield, and the past into a fist you can use to punch your way through, even when the door seems locked. Forever. So began a new chapter. A chapter where being herself became not a privilege, but a choice. Being a master meant being visible. Being strong meant being honest. And having a medal meant not being afraid to remind everyone. Even the quietest woman in the warehouse can be scarier than any cargo if you treat her like an empty space. And somewhere, between the brushbox and rough fingers, this truth remained alive, like a steel imprint on the deepest part of the most complex rifle. 2 weeks later, Elena found herself in an unexpected position. The demonstration had worked too well. Word of the weapons technician who could make impossible shots had spread beyond Fort Davidson, reaching ears that she'd hoped would never notice her again. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked like he'd stepped out of a government handbook on how to appear inconspicuous while being completely obvious. The letter was brief and to the point. Report to Building C, Room 237, 1400 hours. Come alone. Elena knew Building C. It was where conversations happened that never officially occurred, where people discussed things that wouldn't appear in any records. She'd been in rooms like 237 before, on the other side of the table. At precisely 1400 hours, she knocked on the door and entered to find 2 men in identical gray suits sitting across from a single empty chair. The setup was so cliché it almost made her laugh. Almost. Miss Rivera, the older man said, not bothering with introductions. Or should I say, Sergeant Major Elena Rodriguez of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Elena took the offered seat without changing expression. I prefer Rivera these days. Less paperwork. The younger man slid a manila folder across the table. Your demonstration last week was impressive. Remarkably so, for someone whose official record shows only logistics and general weapons maintenance. I'm a quick learner, Elena replied, not touching the folder. Indeed, quick enough to achieve a record that few people in the world can match. The older man opened his own folder. 247 confirmed eliminations across 3 theaters of operation. Longest confirmed kill, 2,847 meters. Average accuracy rating, 98.7%. These aren't the statistics of a logistics specialist. Ms. Rivera Elena remained silent. There was no point in denying what they clearly already knew. We have a problem, the younger man continued. 3 weeks ago, someone began eliminating high-value targets across Eastern Europe. Same MO, same impossible shots, same clinical precision. Someone with your exact skill set. And you think it's me? Elena asked with genuine amusement. Gentlemen, I've been cleaning rifles and teaching basic marksmanship to teenagers. My most dangerous activity lately has been arguing with Sergeant Martinez about requisition forms. No, the older man said. We know it's not you. But we believe it's someone who knows your methods, your techniques. Someone who trained alongside you. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. Marcus Steele, your former spotter, officially died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan 2 years ago. The younger man pulled out a photograph. Unofficially, he's been working as a freelance eliminator. Very exclusive clientele. Very expensive services. Elena studied the photograph. It showed a cafe in Prague, a man in a leather jacket sitting alone at a table. The face was older, scarred, but unmistakably Marcus, her partner for 3 years, the man who'd watched her back through dozens of missions, who'd helped her achieve that impossible accuracy rating. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "We want you to stop him," the older man said simply. "You know how he thinks, how he operates. You're the only person alive who's seen him work up close." Elena leaned back in her chair. "I'm retired, gentlemen. I gave up that life for a reason. We know, and we respect that choice. But Marcus is targeting American interests now. Last week, he eliminated a CIA station chief in Berlin. Before that, a defense contractor in Rome. He's working his way through a list, and we believe that list includes people you once served with." The younger man slid another photograph across the table. Elena recognized the face immediately. Colonel Sarah Chen, her former commanding officer, now working in Pentagon acquisition. "He's hunting Shadow Division alumni," Elena said, the pieces falling into place. "Someone's paying him very well to clean house, to eliminate anyone who might have knowledge of operations that certain parties would prefer stayed buried." The older man closed his folder. "We need this stopped before he reaches the continental United States." Elena stood up. "Find someone else." "I'm not interested in returning to that world." "There is no one else," the younger man called after her. "You're the only person who ever consistently outshot Marcus Steele. You're the only one who can get close enough to stop him." Elena paused at the door. "What makes you think I can still make those shots? It's been 3 years since I held a rifle in anger." "Because," the older man said, "yesterday's demonstration proved that some skills never fade. They just wait for the right moment to resurface." Elena left the building without giving them an answer, but she knew they'd be back. Men like that always came back, with better offers and worse alternatives, until you found yourself doing things you'd sworn you'd never do again. That night, she sat in her Spartan apartment cleaning her service pistol, a ritual she'd maintained even in retirement. The Barrett demonstration had been meant to deflect attention, to prove she was just another technician who happened to be good with rifles. Instead, it had reminded everyone exactly who Elena Rivera used to be. And now, Marcus was out there, using skills she'd helped teach him to eliminate the people they'd once fought beside. The irony wasn't lost on her. The student using the master's techniques against their former comrades. She field-stripped the pistol, cleaning each component with the same methodical precision she'd shown with the Barrett. Some habits died hard. Some skills, once learned, became part of your DNA. The question wasn't whether she could stop Marcus. The question was whether she wanted to become that person again. The one who solved problems with precisely placed bullets, who measured success in confirmed eliminations. Elena reassembled the pistol and slid it back into its holster. Tomorrow she'd return to the armory, back to cleaning rifles and teaching nervous recruits how to hit paper targets at 100 meters. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she found herself mentally calculating wind speed and bullet drop, reviewing the fundamentals of long-range interdiction. Some ghosts, she realized, never really stayed buried. They just waited in the shadows, patient as death itself, for the moment when duty called them back to life. The medal in her cleaning kit wasn't just a souvenir of past achievements. It was a reminder that some debts could only be paid in the currency she'd tried so hard to leave behind. 247 confirmed eliminations. Perhaps it was time to make it 248.